So I'd like to quickly go through the income effects of trade liberalization in the sector-specific model. Just to recall the version that we're presenting, we have two goods, corn and cars, two countries, Mexico and the United States, one mobile factor, which is labor, two specific factors, land, which is good for corn, and capital, which is good for cars. So land can't be used in the car sector, capital isn't used in the corn sector. That's the premise of the model. The factors of production, corn, land, labor, aren't mobile across borders, so Mexican labor can't be used in the United States. U.S. capital can't be used in Mexico. That's an assumption that we make. We assume that there's competition, though, within the country, and factors are paid the value of the marginal product, and the mobile factor is paid then the same thing in the corn sector as in the car sector in the United States, and likewise in Mexico. The mobile factor labor is paid the same thing in the car sector as in the corn sector. We assume that the U.S. is relatively land abundant, and hence Mexico relatively capital abundant, and we assume that they have similar demand patterns. So differences in prices reflect those underlying differences in specific factors rather than in differences in demand. We think about our pre-trade equilibrium then. The United States, because it's relatively land abundant, will have a production possibility frontier that's sort of bowed out towards the corn sector. Mexico, relatively capital abundant, will have a production possibility frontier that's relatively bowed out towards the car sector. So with relatively similar demand patterns, which we can represent by indifference curves if we wanted to, with relatively similar demand patterns, pre-trade prices will differ. The pre-trade price ratio of corn to cars in the United States will be lower than the pre-trade price ratio of corn to cars in Mexico. We can think of this as more simply saying corn is cheap in the United States, cars are cheap in Mexico because of their differences in their production possibilities frontiers, which are due to differences in the relative abundance of specific factors. The U.S. has relatively more land than Mexico has capital, and so corn will be relatively, if they have similar demand patterns, corn will be relatively inexpensive in the United States compared with Mexico. So when they liberalize, Mexico will want to buy corn from the United States because it's cheap in the United States, and people in the United States will want to buy cars from Mexico because cars are relatively inexpensive in Mexico. And again, you can think about these things in terms of the opportunity cost being different in the two countries, and that's what creates the basis for trade. The basis for trade is always this difference in pre-trade price ratios. That's what creates opportunities for becoming better off through trade. When we liberalize then the two countries, so we imagine that pre-trade equilibrium where the countries aren't trading, when they liberalize in the United States, the price of corn will rise. Mexicans come to the border, demand the cheap U.S. corn, so that increase in demand leads to a rise in the price. Since only the price ratio matters, we're going to assume that the price of cars just stays the same. So in our model, of course, the price of corn will change and the price of cars will change, but since the ratio is the only thing that matters for anything in this model, because the numbers don't actually matter, it's only the relative price of corn to the price of cars that matters. We can just assume, for purposes of seeing what's going to be happening in terms of income distribution, we can just assume that the price of cars stays the same in the United States. So, right, going from 5/3 to 6/2 is the same as going from 5/3 to 9/3, so we keep the price of cars the same, since only the ratio matters. So in the U.S., the price of corn rises, the corn sector expands. When the corn sector expands, it needs more of the mobile factor, so the corn sector, in effect, bids up the wage, and the wage rises, the nominal wage rises. We want to know what happens to the real wage, so the wage in terms of the price of corn and the wage in terms of the price of cars. It's clear, since our price of cars isn't rising, staying the same, then the wage in terms of the price of cars is clearly rising. But we're not quite sure what's happening to the wage in terms of the price of corn, because the wage rises, the nominal wage rises, but the price of corn also rises, so it could go up, could go down. We're going to show that it goes down. And to show that, we use this nice little graph, which represents the equilibrium in the labor market. We have the labor in the car sector. This is for the U.S. We have the labor in the car sector measured from that side, the labor in the corn sector measured from this side. So this whole distance represents the total amount of labor available in the United States. So labor can either be in the car sector or in the corn sector. You could have a very small amount of labor in the corn sector and a lot in the car sector, or you could have some allocation where there's a lot of labor, all this labor is in the corn sector and just this much labor is in the car sector. If just this much labor was in the car sector, not very much, then the value of marginal product to labor in the car sector would be really high, because there's very little labor in the car sector. If the allocation of labor were this over here, then the marginal product of labor in the corn sector would be really high, because there's not much labor in the corn sector, and the value of the marginal product of labor in the car sector, if we continued that graph, would be really low. Equilibrium in the labor market is where the two value marginal products are equal, and that generates then the nominal wage, is where the value marginal product of labor in the car sector is equal to the value marginal product of labor in the corn sector, and just we've drawn it here in the middle, and so the equilibrium allocation of labor will be this allocation here. When the U.S. opens up for trade, the price of corn rises, so let's see what happens. The value of marginal product of labor in the corn sector is just the price of corn times the marginal product of labor in the corn sector. So the price of corn is rising, all else equal, so we shift up the value of marginal product of labor in the corn sector, and we can immediately see that there's a change in the equilibrium. The wage used to be this level, let's call it W1, and now the new nominal wage will be this level, W2. So there's the nominal wage rising. We also see there's a shift in labor from the car sector to the corn sector. So the corn sector expands. More labor in the corn sector. So our graph helps us to see that very clearly. We can also see from the graph clearly that the distance by which the value marginal product of labor rises is larger than the distance by which the wage rises. So the value marginal product of labor curve shifts up by a greater distance than the rise in the wage. So intuitively we can see from the graph that the price of corn rise is greater than the wage rise, and so the real wage in the corn sector will fall. But let's prove that. The price of corn rises, and we want to show that the wage and the price of corn, the wage over the price of corn falls. So remember, the wage is equal to the value marginal product of labor in the corn sector, which is just this. So we divide both sides by the price of corn. So now we have the wage divided by the price of corn, and now we just notice this: there's more labor in the corn sector. Remember back here we saw more labor goes into the corn sector in the new equilibrium. If there's more labor in the corn sector, the marginal product of labor in the corn sector is falling. If the marginal product of labor in the corn sector is falling, then the wage divided by the price of corn is falling. So pretty straightforward that the real wage in terms of corn falls, the real wage in terms of cars rises. So for the mobile factor labor, it's ambiguous, the effects. If they like corn, they're worse off, and if they like, these are the mobile factor in the United States, and if the mobile factor in the United States likes cars, then they're better off. Let's look at the fixed factors, the specific factors. The value of marginal product of labor, the value of marginal product of capital, the sector-specific factor in the car sector, is the price of cars times the marginal product of capital. The value of marginal product of land, the land that's used in the corn sector, is the price of corn times the marginal product of land. The price of cars stays the same, we've assumed, for the United States. So there's less labor in the car sector, so the marginal product of capital in the car sector has fallen because by assumption, labor and capital are complementary. The marginal product of capital is higher when you have more labor, so since you have less labor, the marginal product of capital is lower. So the value of marginal product of capital falls, and so owners of capital are worse off. In the land sector, the price of corn rises, and the marginal product of land rises because there's more labor now in the corn sector, so the marginal product of land is higher. So owners of land are better off. So owners of capital are worse off, owners of land are better off. Those are the income distribution effects for the United States. The model is completely symmetrical, so the income distribution effects in Mexico will just be the inverse of these income distribution effects.